Welcome, dear listener, to one of history's most complex and controversial biographical journeys. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, a man whose name evokes both admiration and horror, whose decisions shaped the destiny of millions and whose legacy continues to influence our world today. This is not a story of simple heroes or villains, but rather the tale of a human being whose rise to absolute power reveals the darkest and most compelling aspects of the human condition. As you settle into your comfortable position, allow your breathing to slow and deepen, like the rhythm of the great Russian steppes, where winter winds carry the whispers of history across vast expanses of snow and silence. Feel the tensions of the modern world fade away, replaced by the weight of a century that witnessed humanity's greatest triumphs and most terrible tragedies. A time when the fate of nations hung in the balance and individual decisions could alter the course of civilization itself. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the cobblestone streets of Gori, a small Georgian town nestled in the shadow of the Caucasus mountains, where the scent of wine and bread mingles with the sound of church bells echoing across ancient valleys. Here, in this remote corner of the Russian Empire, a child was born who would grow up to command the largest country on earth, to defeat fascism, and to become one of the most powerful and feared leaders in human history. We will follow Stalin's journey from his humble beginnings as the son of a cobbler to his final days as the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. A transformation so complete and so dramatic that it seems almost mythical in its scope. We will witness his evolution from a young seminary student who dreamed of becoming a priest to a revolutionary who helped overthrow an empire, from a minor Bolshevik organizer to the successor of Lenin, from a Georgian provincial to the leader who would help defeat Nazi Germany and establish the Soviet Union as a global superpower. Let your mind drift like smoke from a peasant's cottage in the Georgian countryside, past ancient monasteries perched on mountain peaks, past the industrial cities that would rise from Stalin's vision, past the battlefields where millions would die in the struggle between fascism and communism. We will explore the paradoxes of this remarkable and terrible man, the poet who became a dictator, the seminary student who destroyed churches, the Georgian who became more Russian than the Russians, the revolutionary who created a new form of tyranny. Tonight, we will seek to understand how a man who began life as Joseph Vissarionovich became Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, and how his personal transformation reflected the broader transformation of Russia from a backward agricultural empire into a modern industrial superpower. We will examine the forces that shaped his character, the decisions that defined his rule, and the consequences that continue to reverberate through history. This is not a story that offers easy answers or simple moral judgments, but rather an exploration of power in its most absolute form, of the price of progress, and of the terrible choices that leaders must sometimes make in the crucible of history. As we journey through Stalin's remarkable life, let the story wash over you like the waters of the Volga, carrying you peacefully toward the shores of sleep, while enriching your understanding of one of the most significant and controversial figures of the modern age. Chapter 1. Child of the Caucasus, 1878 to 1894. Our story begins on December 18th, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori, where Joseph Vissarionis Dzhugashvili was born into a world of poverty, violence, and ancient traditions. The child who would become Stalin entered life in a modest two-room house on Sobonaya Street, the third son of Vissarion Dzhugashvili, a cobbler whose drinking and violent temper would cast a dark shadow over his family, and Ketevan Geladze, a devoutly religious woman whose fierce love for her surviving son would shape his early years in ways that would echo throughout his life. Picture, if you will, the Gori of Stalin's childhood. A dusty provincial town of perhaps 7,000 inhabitants, dominated by the ruins of an ancient fortress that had once guarded the strategic passes through the Caucasus Mountains. The streets were unpaved and muddy, lined with simple stone houses where Georgian, Armenian, and Russian families lived side by side in the complex ethnic tapestry that characterized this borderland of the Russian Empire. The air was filled with the sounds of different languages, the smell of bread baking in communal ovens, and the constant reminder of imperial authority in the form of Russian officials and Orthodox churches that stood alongside the ancient Georgian monasteries. The Georgia of Stalin's youth was a land caught between worlds, a proud nation with a 1,000-year history of independence that had been absorbed into the Russian Empire less than a century before his birth. The Georgian language, with its unique alphabet and ancient literary traditions, was being suppressed in favor of Russian, while the Georgian Orthodox Church was being subordinated to the Russian Orthodox hierarchy. This cultural tension would profoundly influence the young Stalin, creating in him a complex relationship with his Georgian identity that would persist throughout his life. Vissarion Dzhugashvili was a man destroyed by his circumstances, a skilled craftsman whose trade was being undermined by the Industrial Revolution that was slowly reaching even the remote corners of the Caucasus. As machine-made shoes began to replace handcrafted ones, Vissarion's income declined, and he turned increasingly to alcohol to escape his frustrations. His drinking led to violent rages that terrorized his family, and young Joseph learned early that the world was a dangerous place where survival depended on cunning, strength, and the ability to endure pain without showing weakness. The relationship between Stalin and his father was marked by fear, resentment, and a determination never to be vulnerable again. Vissarion's beatings were frequent and severe, leaving physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. But rather than breaking the boy's spirit, this abuse seemed to forge it into something harder and more resilient. Stalin learned to hide his emotions, to present a calm exterior while calculating his responses, and to view violence as a normal part of human relationships. His mother, Ketevan, known as Kiki, was the dominant influence in Stalin's early life. A woman of remarkable strength and determination who was determined that her son would escape the poverty and violence that had claimed her husband. She was deeply religious, attending church services regularly and instilling in her son a respect for ritual, hierarchy, and absolute authority that would later manifest itself in very different forms. Most importantly, she was ambitious for her son in a way that was unusual for a woman of her class and time, dreaming that he might become a priest and thereby achieve a status and security that had been denied to his father. Picture young Joseph in the narrow streets of Gori, a small, dark-haired boy with penetrating eyes and a serious demeanor that set him apart from his playmates. He was not a particularly attractive child. Smallpox had left his face scarred, and a childhood accident had left his left arm slightly deformed. But he possessed an intensity and intelligence that commanded attention. He was a natural leader among the local children, organizing games and adventures with a combination of charisma and ruthlessness that would characterize his entire life. The boy's intellectual gifts became apparent early, and despite the family's poverty, Kiki was determined that her son would receive an education. In 1888, when Stalin was 10 years old, she managed to enroll him in the Gori church school, where he would receive his first formal education in Russian language and Orthodox theology. It was a significant sacrifice for a family that could barely afford food. But Kiki understood that education was the only path out of poverty for her son. At the church school, Stalin proved to be an exceptional student, mastering Russian with remarkable speed and showing a particular aptitude for memorization and logical argument. His teachers were impressed by his intelligence and his ability to absorb complex theological concepts, and they began to see in him the makings of a future priest. But even as he excelled academically, Stalin was developing the personality traits that would define his adult character: a love of power, a talent for manipulation, and a capacity for holding grudges that bordered on the pathological. The religious education that Stalin received during these formative years would have a profound and lasting impact on his worldview, even after he had rejected Christianity in favor of Marxism. The Orthodox Church's emphasis on hierarchy, ritual, and absolute obedience to authority would later be reflected in the Communist Party structure that Stalin would create. The theological concepts of sin, redemption, and the struggle between good and evil would be transformed into the Marxist dialectic of class struggle and historical inevitability. Most importantly, the Church's claim to possess absolute truth and its intolerance of dissent would find their secular expression in Stalin's later treatment of political opposition. During his years at the church school, Stalin also began to develop his lifelong fascination with Georgian history and literature, particularly the epic poem The Knight in the Panther's Skin by Shota Rustaveli. This medieval masterpiece, with its themes of loyalty, betrayal, and the triumph of will over circumstance, would remain one of Stalin's favorite works throughout his life, and its influence can be seen in his later political philosophy and personal conduct. The young Stalin was also beginning to show signs of the paranoia and suspicion that would later characterize his rule. He was quick to perceive slights and insults, real or imagined, and he had an extraordinary memory for those who had wronged him. His classmates learned to be careful around him, sensing that beneath his quiet exterior lay a capacity for revenge that was both patient and implacable. As Stalin approached his 16th birthday, his academic achievements had earned him a scholarship to the Tiflis Seminary, the most prestigious religious institution in Georgia and a stepping stone to a career in the Orthodox Church. For Kiki, this represented the fulfillment of her greatest dream. Her son would become a priest, a man of learning and respect who would never have to worry about poverty or violence again. For Stalin himself, the seminary represented an opportunity to escape the limitations of provincial life and to test himself against the best minds of his generation. As you continue to relax and drift towards sleep, picture the teenage Stalin on the day he left Gori for Tiflis, standing at the window of the horse-drawn carriage that would carry him to his destiny. Behind him lies the small town where he learned the harsh lessons of survival and the intoxicating taste of intellectual superiority. Ahead lies the capital of Georgia, a cosmopolitan city where he will encounter new ideas, new challenges, and new opportunities to exercise the power that he is already beginning to crave. He is 16 years old, the son of a cobbler and a washerwoman, but he carries within him the seeds of greatness and terror that will one day reshape the world. Chapter 2: The Making of a Revolutionary, 1894 to 1917. The Tiflis Seminary that welcomed the 16-year-old Stalin in September 1894 was one of the most important educational institutions in the Caucasus, an imposing complex of buildings that housed nearly 600 students from across Georgia, Armenia, and other regions of the Russian Empire. Founded in 1817, the seminary was designed to train Orthodox priests who would serve the spiritual needs of the empire's diverse populations, while also serving as agents of Russian cultural and political influence in the borderlands. Picture the scene as young Stalin first walked through the gates of the seminary, carrying his few possessions in a simple cloth bundle, his dark eyes taking in every detail of his new environment. The buildings were constructed in the classical Russian style, with their yellow walls and white columns speaking of imperial authority and orthodox tradition. The courtyards were filled with young men in black cassocks, their heads shaved in the monastic fashion, their voices raised in theological debate or hushed in prayer. The seminary's curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive, designed to produce not just priests, but educated men who could serve the empire in various capacities. Students studied Latin, Greek, and Church Slavonic, alongside Russian literature, history, and mathematics. They were required to attend multiple religious services each day, to observe strict rules of conduct, and to submit to a discipline that was both physical and spiritual. For many students, the seminary represented their first exposure to the wider world of ideas and their first taste of intellectual freedom. But Stalin's experience at the seminary was marked by conflict and rebellion from almost the very beginning. The young Georgian was intellectually gifted enough to excel in his studies, but he chafed against the rigid discipline and the constant surveillance that characterized seminary life. The Russian authorities who ran the institution were suspicious of Georgian nationalism and worked actively to suppress any expression of local culture or identity. Students were forbidden to speak Georgian, to read Georgian literature, or to discuss Georgian history except in the most approved contexts. This cultural suppression had a profound effect on Stalin, awakening in him a sense of Georgian identity that had been largely dormant during his childhood in Gori. He began to read Georgian poetry and literature in secret, to participate in clandestine discussions about Georgian history and culture, and to develop a resentment against Russian authority that would influence his political development for years to come. Paradoxically, the very institution that was designed to make him a loyal servant of the Russian Empire was instead turning him into a rebel and a revolutionary. Stalin's academic performance during his early years at the seminary was excellent, and his teachers initially had high hopes for his future as a priest. He showed particular aptitude for theological argument and biblical interpretation, skills that would later serve him well in his political career. But as he progressed through his studies, his behavior became increasingly problematic. He was frequently disciplined for reading forbidden books, for speaking Georgian, and for what his teachers described as disrespectful behavior toward authority figures. The transformation of Stalin from a promising seminary student into a revolutionary began around 1896, when he first encountered the writings of Karl Marx and other socialist theorists. These books were strictly forbidden in the seminary, but they circulated secretly among students who were hungry for new ideas and alternative visions of the future. For Stalin, Marxism provided a comprehensive explanation for the injustices he had witnessed throughout his life, from his father's economic struggles to the cultural oppression he experienced at the seminary. Picture the young Stalin in his dormitory cell late at night, reading by candlelight the revolutionary texts that would reshape his understanding of the world. The works of Marx, Engels, and Plekhanov opened his eyes to concepts of class struggle, historical materialism, and the inevitable triumph of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. These ideas resonated powerfully with his own experiences of poverty and oppression, providing him with both an intellectual framework for understanding society and a program for changing it. The influence of Marxism on Stalin's thinking was profound and lasting, but he approached it in a characteristically practical and selective manner. He was less interested in the philosophical subtleties of dialectical materialism than in its implications for political action. He saw in Marxism not just a theory of history, but a blueprint for revolution, a guide to the seizure and exercise of power that appealed to his increasingly authoritarian temperament. By 1898, Stalin had become one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement within the seminary, organizing secret meetings, distributing forbidden literature, and recruiting other students to the cause. His activities brought him to the attention of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, who began to compile a file on the young revolutionary that would grow thicker with each passing year. The seminary authorities, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to control or reform their troublesome students. The final break came in May 1899, when Stalin failed to appear for his final examinations and was formally expelled from the seminary. The official reason given was his failure to pay tuition fees, but the real cause was his revolutionary activities and his complete rejection of the religious vocation for which he had been trained. At the age of 20, Stalin had burned his bridges with the Orthodox Church and committed himself fully to the revolutionary cause. The years that followed Stalin's expulsion from the seminary were marked by poverty danger, and gradual rise within the ranks of the Georgian social democratic movement. He found work as a clerk at the Tiflis Observatory, a position that provided him with a modest income while allowing him time to pursue his revolutionary activities. He began writing articles for underground newspapers, organizing workers' study circles, and participating in strikes and demonstrations against the Tsarist regime. Stalin's approach to revolutionary work was characterized by the same methodical thoroughness that had marked his academic studies. He studied the writings of Lenin with particular care, finding in the Bolshevik leaders' emphasis on party discipline and professional revolutionaries a philosophy that matched his own temperament and ambitions. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were drawn to the romantic aspects of revolutionary activity, Stalin understood that successful revolution required organization, discipline, and the willingness to make difficult and sometimes ruthless decisions. His first arrest came in 1902 when the police raided a social democratic meeting in Batumi where Stalin was speaking to a group of oil workers. He was imprisoned for over a year before being sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia, the first of many such sentences he would receive over the next 15 years. But rather than discouraging him, these experiences of imprisonment and exile only strengthened his commitment to the revolutionary cause and his determination to overthrow the Tsarist regime. The period from 1902 to 1917 was marked by a cycle of revolutionary activity, arrest, imprisonment, escape, and return to the underground that would define Stalin's life and character. He became expert at living under false identities, at evading police surveillance, and at the complex logistics of underground organization. He participated in bank robberies and other expropriations that funded revolutionary activities, demonstrating a willingness to use violence in pursuit of political goals that would later characterize his rule. During this period, Stalin also began to develop his skills as a political organizer and theorist, writing articles on the national question and other topics that brought him to the attention of Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders. His Georgian background gave him insights into the complex ethnic and national issues that would become increasingly important as the Russian Empire began to disintegrate, and his practical experience in underground work made him valuable to a party that was preparing for revolution. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities and challenges for the revolutionary movement. The war's enormous costs in blood and treasure weakened the Tsarist regime and created conditions that would eventually lead to its collapse. Stalin, like other Bolshevik leaders, opposed Russian participation in what he saw as an imperialist war, but he also recognized that the war's disruptions might create opportunities for revolutionary action. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine Stalin in his final Siberian exile in the remote village of Kureyka, where he spent the war years from 1913 to 1917. The landscape is harsh and unforgiving, with temperatures that drop to 50 degrees below zero and months of darkness that test the human spirit. But Stalin endures as he has always endured, using the time to read, to think, and to prepare for the opportunities that he knows will come. He is 38 years old, a seasoned revolutionary, who has spent nearly 2 decades preparing for the moment when the old world will collapse and a new one will be born from its ashes. Chapter 3: Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1924. The year 1917 dawned with the Russian Empire in the grip of a crisis that would ultimately destroy the 1,000-year-old Romanov dynasty and reshape the political landscape of the entire world. The Great War had claimed millions of Russian lives, devastated the economy, and exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Tsarist system. In the frozen wastes of Siberia, Stalin received news of these momentous events with the calm satisfaction of a man who had long predicted the collapse of the old order and who was now preparing to help build its replacement. The February Revolution that toppled Tsar Nicholas II found Stalin still in exile in the remote village of Kureyka, but the general amnesty that followed the Tsar's abdication allowed him to return to European Russia for the first time in 4 years. Picture the scene as Stalin boarded the Trans-Siberian Railway in March 1917, a 38-year-old revolutionary whose years of exile had hardened his features and deepened his understanding of power. The journey westward took him through a country in the throes of revolutionary transformation, where soldiers were deserting their units, peasants were seizing land, and workers were taking control of factories. Stalin's arrival in Petrograd in late March placed him at the center of the revolutionary maelstrom that was engulfing the former capital of the Russian Empire. The city was a cauldron of competing political forces, where the provisional government struggled to maintain order, while the Petrograd Soviet claimed to represent the true will of the people. The Bolshevik Party, to which Stalin had devoted his adult life, was still a minority faction, but it was growing rapidly under the leadership of Lenin, who had returned from exile with his famous April Theses, calling for immediate socialist revolution. Stalin's role in the events of 1917 was significant but not central, reflecting his position as an important but not yet dominant figure within the Bolshevik leadership. He was elected to the party's Central Committee and became one of the editors of Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper, giving him a platform to influence party policy and public opinion. His articles during this period revealed a political sophistication and tactical flexibility that impressed his colleagues and demonstrated his growing mastery of revolutionary strategy. The failed coup attempt by General Kornilov in August 1917 provided the Bolsheviks with a crucial opportunity to present themselves as the defenders of the revolution against counter-revolutionary forces. Stalin played an important role in organizing the party's response to the crisis, helping to coordinate the defense of Petrograd and to mobilize workers and soldiers against the threat of military dictatorship. The successful defeat of Kornilov's forces significantly enhanced Bolshevik prestige and set the stage for their seizure of power 2 months later. The October Revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power was a carefully planned and executed operation that demonstrated Lenin's genius for revolutionary timing and organization. Stalin's contribution to the success of the revolution was substantial, but largely behind the scenes, involving the coordination of party activities, the management of communications, and the countless practical details that made the seizure of power possible. While Trotsky commanded the Military Revolutionary Committee that actually captured the key points in Petrograd, Stalin worked to ensure that the party apparatus functioned smoothly and that the revolution's success would be consolidated and extended. Picture the scene in the Smolny Institute during those crucial days in October 1917, as the Bolshevik leadership worked around the clock to coordinate the revolution that would change the world. Stalin was there in the midst of it all, a quiet but essential presence, who handled the practical details, while others made the dramatic speeches and issued the stirring proclamations. His ability to manage complex logistics and to maintain his composure under pressure made him invaluable to Lenin, who was beginning to recognize in his Georgian comrade a man who could be trusted with the most sensitive and important tasks. The immediate aftermath of the October Revolution presented the new Bolshevik government with challenges that would have overwhelmed a less determined leadership. The country was still at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The economy was in ruins, and most of the population was either hostile or indifferent to the new regime. Stalin was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, a position that reflected both his expertise in ethnic and national questions, and Lenin's recognition of his administrative abilities. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with Germany in March 1918, ended Russian participation in World War I, but at an enormous cost in territory and resources. Stalin supported Lenin's decision to accept the harsh German terms, understanding that the survival of the Bolshevik regime required peace at almost any price. This pragmatic approach to political decision-making, prioritizing the consolidation of power over ideological purity, would become a hallmark of Stalin's leadership style throughout his career. The Russian Civil War that erupted in 1918 was a brutal conflict that pitted the Bolshevik Reds against a coalition of white forces that included monarchists, liberals, and moderate socialists, all united in their opposition to Bolshevik rule. The war was fought across the vast expanse of the former Russian Empire, from the Baltic to the Pacific, and it claimed millions of lives while devastating what remained of the country's economy and infrastructure. Stalin's role in the Civil War was crucial to the ultimate Bolshevik victory, though it was often overshadowed by the more dramatic contributions of military leaders like Trotsky and Tukhachevsky. As a member of the Revolutionary Military Council, and as a political commissar attached to various fronts, Stalin demonstrated the combination of political acumen and ruthless determination that would later characterize his rule. He was particularly effective at maintaining party discipline within the Red Army and at coordinating the complex logistics that kept Bolshevik forces supplied and equipped. The defense of Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad in his honor, in 1918 was one of Stalin's most significant contributions to the Civil War effort. The city was strategically crucial, controlling access to the grain-producing regions of the south and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalin's successful defense of the city against white forces, commanded by General Denikin, demonstrated his ability to combine political leadership with military strategy, and it established his reputation as one of the most effective Bolshevik commanders. Picture Stalin during the siege of Tsaritsyn, standing on the banks of the Volga as artillery shells explode around him, his calm demeanor providing reassurance to the defenders, while his strategic mind calculates the moves necessary to break the enemy's assault. He is 40 years old, a man who has found his element in the crucible of revolutionary war, where his capacity for hard decisions and his indifference to human suffering serve the cause he has embraced with religious fervor. The Civil War also revealed the darker aspects of Stalin's character that would later define his rule. He was quick to use terror as a political weapon, ordering the execution of suspected counter-revolutionaries and the implementation of harsh measures against civilian populations in contested areas. His conflicts with other Bolshevik leaders, particularly Trotsky, during this period foreshadowed the power struggles that would dominate Soviet politics after Lenin's death. The Bolshevik victory in the Civil War by 1921 left the country exhausted and devastated, but it also established the Communist Party as the undisputed ruler of what would become the Soviet Union. The new economic policy, NEP, introduced by Lenin in 1921, represented a tactical retreat from pure socialism, allowing limited private enterprise and market mechanisms to help rebuild the shattered economy. Stalin supported the NEP as a necessary compromise, but he also began to develop ideas about rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization that would later become central to his own policies. Lenin's declining health after 1921 created a succession crisis that would ultimately determine the future direction of the Soviet Union. Stalin's appointment as General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922 seemed like a routine administrative position, but it gave him control over party personnel, an organization that he would use with devastating effectiveness in the struggle for power that followed Lenin's death. As you continue your peaceful journey towards sleep, imagine Stalin in his modest office in the Kremlin during the final months of Lenin's life, working late into the night on the countless administrative details that keep the party and the state functioning. He is 44 years old, a man who has survived revolution, civil war, and the countless dangers of underground life to emerge as one of the most powerful figures in the new Soviet state. Outside his window, the lights of Moscow twinkle in the darkness, while beyond the city limits, the vast expanse of the Soviet Union stretches toward horizons that he is already beginning to dream of transforming through the application of will, organization, and revolutionary determination. Chapter 4: The Struggle for Succession, 1924 to 1929. The death of Vladimir Lenin on January 21, 1924, marked the end of an era and the beginning of a power struggle that would determine not only the leadership of the Soviet Union, but the future direction of the world's first socialist state. Lenin's passing left a vacuum at the heart of the Bolshevik Party that several ambitious and capable leaders were eager to fill, each representing different visions of how the revolution should proceed and what the Soviet Union should become. Picture the scene in the Hall of Columns in Moscow, where Lenin's body lay in state as hundreds of thousands of mourners filed past to pay their respects to the man who had led them through revolution and civil war. Among the members of the Politburo who stood guard over the coffin was Stalin, his face a mask of grief and determination, already calculating the moves that would secure his position as Lenin's successor. The other mourners could not have imagined that this quiet Georgian, who seemed so much less charismatic than his rivals, would within a few years become the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. The most obvious candidate to succeed Lenin was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator and military strategist who had organized the October Revolution and led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War. Trotsky was internationally famous, intellectually gifted, and possessed of a revolutionary pedigree that seemed to make him the natural heir to Lenin's legacy. But Trotsky also had weaknesses that Stalin was quick to exploit. He was arrogant. He had joined the Bolsheviks only in 1917, and his Jewish background made him vulnerable to anti-Semitic prejudices that persisted even within the party. Stalin's strategy for defeating Trotsky and his other rivals was masterful in its subtlety and ruthlessness. Rather than engaging in dramatic public confrontations, he worked behind the scenes to build a coalition of party officials who owed their positions to his patronage as General Secretary. He presented himself as a moderate voice of reason, opposed to both Trotsky's radical internationalism and the rightist tendencies of leaders like Bukharin and Rykov. Most importantly, he used his control over party personnel to place his supporters in key positions throughout the Soviet hierarchy. The theoretical debates that dominated Soviet politics during this period were not merely academic exercises, but struggles over the fundamental direction of the revolution. Trotsky advocated for permanent revolution, arguing that socialism could not survive in one country and that the Soviet Union must actively promote revolution throughout the world. Stalin, by contrast, developed the theory of socialism in one country, arguing that the Soviet Union should focus on building socialism at home rather than pursuing risky adventures abroad. Picture Stalin in the party meetings and conferences where these debates took place, sitting quietly while his more eloquent rivals delivered passionate speeches about revolutionary theory and international strategy. He rarely spoke at length, but when he did, his words carried weight because they reflected the practical concerns of party officials who were more interested in consolidating power than in theoretical purity. His Georgian accent and simple speaking style made him seem more accessible and trustworthy than the cosmopolitan intellectuals who dominated the party leadership. The publication of Lenin's testament in 1924, with its warning about Stalin's accumulation of power and its suggestion that he be removed from the position of General Secretary, represented a serious threat to Stalin's ambitions. But Stalin's control over the party apparatus allowed him to survive this crisis, as his supporters argued that Lenin's concerns had been addressed and that Stalin had learned from his mistakes. The fact that Lenin had also criticized other potential successors helped Stalin deflect attention from his own shortcomings. Stalin's alliance with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev against Trotsky was a crucial element in his rise to power, even though it was ultimately temporary. These two old Bolsheviks brought legitimacy and experience to Stalin's cause, while their control over the Leningrad and Moscow party organizations provided him with additional sources of support. The triumvirate, as it came to be known, successfully marginalized Trotsky and removed him from his position as Commissar of War in 1925. The economic debates of the mid-1920s provided Stalin with another opportunity to position himself as the voice of moderation and practical wisdom, while the left opposition, led by Trotsky, called for rapid industrialization and the abandonment of the new economic policy, and the right opposition, led by Bukharin, advocated for a continuation of market-oriented reforms. Stalin argued for a middle course that would gradually build socialism while maintaining political stability. But Stalin's moderation during this period was largely tactical, designed to build support while he consolidated his power. Behind the scenes, he was already developing plans for the rapid transformation of Soviet society that would make Trotsky's proposals seem conservative by comparison. His support for the NEP was genuine but temporary, a necessary compromise that would be abandoned once he had secured his position as undisputed leader. The defeat of the left opposition in 1926 to 1927 marked a crucial turning point in Stalin's rise to power. Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were expelled from the party and sent into exile, eliminating the most serious threats to Stalin's leadership. The methods used to achieve these victories, manipulation of party procedures, character assassination, and the gradual restriction of debate, foreshadowed the techniques that Stalin would later use to eliminate all opposition to his rule. Picture the scene at the 15th Party Congress in December 1927, where the left opposition made its final stand against Stalin's growing dominance. The delegates, carefully selected by Stalin's apparatus, listened in hostile silence as Trotsky and his supporters delivered their last speeches defending the principles of international revolution and party democracy. When the votes were counted, the opposition was crushed, and Stalin emerged as the clear victor in the struggle for Lenin's succession. The elimination of the left opposition allowed Stalin to turn his attention to the right opposition, led by Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky. These men had been Stalin's allies in the fight against Trotsky, but their commitment to the NEP and gradual economic development put them at odds with Stalin's increasingly radical plans for Soviet transformation. The conflict with the right opposition would be more complex and prolonged than the struggle with Trotsky, but its outcome was never really in doubt. Stalin's break with his former allies was gradual and carefully orchestrated, designed to minimize the political costs while maximizing his freedom of action. He began by questioning their commitment to socialist construction, then moved to challenge their economic policies, and finally accused them of representing the interests of the kulaks and other class enemies. By 1929, the right opposition had been defeated as thoroughly as the left opposition before it, leaving Stalin as the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. The transformation of Stalin from a member of the collective leadership to the sole ruler of the Soviet Union was complete by 1929, but it had been achieved through methods that fundamentally altered the nature of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. The party that had once prided itself on its democratic traditions and open debate had become a hierarchical organization where dissent was increasingly dangerous, and where loyalty to the leader was more important than adherence to principle. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine Stalin on his 50th birthday in December 1929, standing alone in his Kremlin office as snow falls silently outside his window. He has achieved what once seemed impossible, rising from obscurity to become the leader of the world's largest country and the heir to Lenin's revolutionary legacy. But the methods he has used to achieve power have changed him, hardening his heart and sharpening his paranoia, preparing him for the even greater struggles that lie ahead as he prepares to transform the Soviet Union according to his own vision of socialist construction. Chapter 5: The Great Transformation, 1929 to 1939. The year 1929 marked the beginning of the most dramatic and traumatic decade in Soviet history, a period when Stalin would attempt to transform the Soviet Union from a backward agricultural country into a modern industrial power through the sheer force of will and state coercion. The policies he implemented during this period, rapid industrialization, agricultural collectivization, and the elimination of all potential opposition, would reshape Soviet society in ways that would endure for generations and would establish the template for totalitarian rule that would influence the entire 20th century. Stalin's decision to abandon the new economic policy and embark on a program of rapid socialist construction was driven by a combination of ideological conviction, practical necessity, and personal ambition. He genuinely believed that the Soviet Union faced an existential threat from the capitalist powers that surrounded it, and that only rapid industrialization could provide the military strength necessary for survival. But he also understood that such a transformation would require the concentration of unprecedented power in his own hands and the elimination of all sources of potential resistance. Picture the scene in the Kremlin during the winter of 1929 to 1930, as Stalin and his closest associates worked through the night to finalize the plans that would reshape the lives of 60 million Soviet citizens. The offices were filled with maps, statistics, and reports from across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, while teams of economists and planners calculated the resources and manpower that would be needed to achieve the impossible goals that Stalin had set for his country. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928 but dramatically accelerated in 1929, called for increases in industrial production that seemed to defy economic logic. Steel production was to increase by 300%, coal by 200%, and electricity by 400%, all within 5 years. New industrial cities were to be built in the wilderness. Massive hydroelectric dams were to harness the power of Siberian rivers, and the Soviet Union was to become self-sufficient in all the key technologies of modern warfare and industry. The human cost of this industrial revolution was enormous, but Stalin viewed it as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of socialist construction. Millions of peasants were forced to leave their villages to work in the new factories and construction sites, where they labored under conditions that were often brutal and dangerous. The enthusiasm of the early years, when young communists volunteered to build socialism with their bare hands, gradually gave way to a system of coercion and terror that made industrial targets into matters of life and death. The collectivization of agriculture, launched simultaneously with the industrialization drive, was even more traumatic in its impact on Soviet society. Stalin's decision to eliminate private farming and force peasants into